The reason this topic interests me is because I spent years and years scuffling around in various bands back in the day, back in my youth, and I never got anywhere. You know, none of the bands I played with ever gravitated beyond the pub circuit, really, and it was always a dream of mine to, you know, maybe one day play in a band that was going to make it big. And but it never happened. So it's always interested me, this idea that a musician would choose to walk out of a band just as fame and success is beckoning, and what guts it must take, or what a kind of form of insanity in my mind. And there are a few examples here I've got where the musician had already made it big, so maybe if you've already made it big, it doesn't quite matter so much. But there are a few examples here of musicians who walked out either on the cusp of the fame and success or just after the fame and success had started. So to me, it just, I don't know, it slightly scrambles my mind, really, the idea that somebody would do that. So Denny Laine is an interesting one. He was in the original version of the Moody Blues, who scored a big hit. I think it was the Christmas of 1964 in the British pop charts with their cover version of the Bessie Banks tune Go Now, of course, which was a big hit. And Denny responded to the sudden fame and acclaim by immediately leaving the Moody Blues, essentially, and disappearing off into obscurity for the next, I don't know what it was, like 4 or 5 years. I'm sure it wasn't his intention to wander off into obscurity. He formed the Electric String Band, which went nowhere. He teamed up briefly with Ginger Baker, that went nowhere. He helped form a Birmingham-based or a Midlands band called Balls, which went nowhere. So essentially he walked out on stardom in order to, I think the other guys in the Moody Blues, the drummer, Graham Edge, said that he got the impression that Denny wanted his name out in lights, and he realised it was never going to be Denny Laine and the Moody Blues, so really he wanted to leave in order to get his own name up in lights. And of course, ironically, that never really happened, because the big gig that he ended up getting was in Wings, where he ended up being the absolute archetypal sideman to Paul McCartney, forever in McCartney's shadow. But yeah, for whatever reason, Denny decided he was going to walk out on the Moody Blues just as they'd got a huge big #1 single. Talking of Wings, of course, you know, loads of musicians left that band. The most famous example being Danny Sywell and Henry McCulloch, the guitarist and drummer, walking out on Paul just before the Lagos sessions that produced Band on the Run. And that really beggars the mind too, the idea that you'd be playing with Paul McCartney in his first post-Beatles outfit and you just leave the band, you know. But I think in that case there were problems with money and contracts and all kinds of things. There were various issues. This is the thing, you know, fame and success and being in a big band is probably not all it's cut out to be. This is another favourite one of mine, Bill Bruford, and I'm showing this because this is the final Yes album he played on for many years, Close to the Edge. Now, Bill Bruford, of course, was a very dedicated and brilliant jazz rock drummer, and he waited until Yes had scored big in the American charts with Close to the Edge, and then he promptly left the band and went off and joined King Crimson. And in his autobiography years later, he said that Chris Squire, the bass player, had tried to reason with him and said, "Bill, it is absolutely insane. We've been working flat out for 4 years in order to get to where we are. We're just about to get onto the stadium circuit in America, and you're going to leave and join King Crimson, who are basically a bit of an underground cult band who've never had a hit record." And Bill Bruford said in his book, he said, "I got this impression that Chris Squire thought that this album was the beginning of something, but to me it was the end of something." And he compared it to participating in a heist or a bank robbery. The idea is that you plan it carefully and you work really hard to pull it off, and then when you pull it off, it's kind of like, hooray, we've done it, and you can all ride off into the sunset. And for Bill, when Close to the Edge was a huge hit and the stadium circuit beckoned to him, that was kind of like, well, I'm not interested in slipping around the stadium circuit just endlessly playing that material. As far as I'm concerned, we've cracked it. I might as well go off and do something more interesting. What a brave decision to make, but he just decided it wasn't about the fame and the acclaim for him, it was the music, and for him, King Crimson were making more interesting music. So that was just how it was going to go. And then staying on the prog theme for a moment, I suppose, in a way, a very similar one. We've got Peter Gabriel and Genesis. Peter left the band, I'm not going to say just as they were about to become huge, because they were already on their way up. They were already quite a big band. They never had a big major hit record that was going to come after Peter left, but they definitely had a big reputation as an international touring band. They'd made some you know, fairly big records. They definitely had a name. Genesis were one of the Goliaths, really, of mid-1970s prog music. But Peter just decided at some point that he'd had enough after this album. He felt like he'd painted himself into a corner. He'd written his masterpiece. He'd become a father for the first time, I think. And that was one issue. He was driving around back into the studio, you know, long drives. I don't think he felt as if the other members of the band were cutting him enough slack. So there were some personal tensions coming in. But anyway, after this record, he decided he'd had enough. He walked out of the band. And, you know, the rest was history. He wrote that great song on his first solo album, Salisbury Hill, which was basically telling the story of him escaping from the machinery of the rock business. And what a wonderful song that was. And obviously it launched this fantastic solo career, which ended up being, at least for a while, as big as Genesis were. Yeah, Peter Gabriel and Genesis. And he wasn't the only one. You also had Steve Hackett, who left Genesis maybe a couple of albums later. So after Peter left, they did Trick of the Tail, they did Wind and Wuthering, and then Steve left. And I think it might have been because Wind and Wuthering is a very Tony Banks dominated record, you know, an awful lot of keyboards on there. The power structures in the band, I think, had shifted. Steve was always with Phil Collins slightly on the outskirts of it all because he wasn't a public schoolboy, essentially, and I think there were some power tussles in that band. Steve was developing as a writer, as a songwriter, and I don't think he felt like he was really ever going to get his share of the spotlight in Genesis. So he quit the band, never went back, launched a solo career, which was never huge. He never became a kind of huge solo star, but he did manage to carve a very successful career, as careers go. And obviously he's still out there to this day, and he still, you know, he still trades on the Genesis material. But obviously, you know, it's a huge part of his life and his career, I guess. But there came a point where he decided that enough was enough, and that he'd rather go off and presumably play much smaller venues and give up the chance of going for that ride with Genesis. Obviously, he didn't realise probably at that point that Genesis's career was going to go absolutely through the roof when Phil Collins properly zoned into view as their frontman. This is quite a nice example. We've got Lol, Cream and Kevin Godley and Cream from 10cc, who left the band after the band's fourth album, this one, How Dare You. Let's see if we can find them in the picture. Actually, no, it's going to be too much trouble. I can see them, but it's going to be far too much trouble pointing them out to you. So 10cc, formed in Stockport, were very much really a game of two halves. You had the pop duo of Kevin Godley and Eric Stewart, and then you had the RT2, who were Lol Cream and Kevin Godley. And that's a bit simplistic, really, but that was basically the dynamic of that group. You had the two with the commercial instincts and the two with the sort of wacky, far-out, Frank Zappa-esque instinct, and the two pop guys, Eric and Graham, were quite happy to continue doing 10cc as a pop band and maybe following the formula a little bit, and that really wasn't going to appeal to Godley and Cream at all. Kevin Godley said later that after they did the third album, which was the original soundtrack, they did that huge piece, Une Nuit à Paris, which is this big progressive art rock suite. I think the record company were leaning on them after that, each time to do another big piece. His reaction to that was to say, I'd rather do lots of little short pieces. You know, we've done the great big piece. Why do we need to do it again? Anyway, a couple of other factors came into play. They wanted to work on their gizmo guitar bowing device. They had a few other ideas up their sleeve, but essentially they just wanted to get out of the machinery again, like Peter Gabriel, and do their own thing. In later years, maybe there was a little bit of regret, because I think looking back, you know, they could easily probably have taken a couple of years out and made a solo album and then, you know, came back to the fold again, which is quite normal procedure nowadays. But back in those days, it kind of wasn't seen as the done thing, really, to go off and do solo stuff. It was almost seen as being, being disloyal to the band. So they couldn't really do that. So anyway, they went off and launched a solo career that was more of a cult thing, really. 10cc without them, you know, went on to some really big hit records, but they were never the same again, really. Okay, so just a couple of, one quite quirky one now, which I wanted to mention. This is Electric Light Orchestra and El Dorado, and I wanted to just really quickly tell this story because I think it's quite a funny one. The guy in this band who left just as they were about to become really huge was their cello player, one of their cello players, Mike Edwards. This was the album that broke them big in America. Can't Get It Out of My Head was a top 10 single. They did a huge American tour, and Mike Edwards left the band in order to be a postman. And that was the story of that, really. He was getting into transcendental meditation, and he just decided one day, he came off the stage, went back to the hotel, and just announced to the band, sorry guys, I'm leaving, packed his bags, left, and went off to become a postman. Leaving ELO to scale the heights. So from the next album onwards, their career started to go up into the ascendancy, and they were one of the biggest bands in the world a couple of years later. But Mike wasn't interested. He wanted to deliver the mail instead, so that's what he did. Sad postscript to that story: many years later, he was killed whilst out driving down a country lane. He was following a tractor that had lots of bales of hay on the back of it, and the tractor crashed into something, I think, and the bales of hay fell off the back of the tractor and crushed Mike Edwards in his car. So pretty horrendous story there, but I thought it was quite a good story with the postman thing anyway, which is why I thought I'd include it. Squeeze were cropping up in a lot of my videos at the moment. So Jules Holland had left the band, the previous record, Argy Bargy. Jules left the band because of line-up tensions, managerial tensions. Just as the band was starting to make headroads in America, Paul Carrack came in and filled Jules's shoes, sang lead vocals on the song Tempted. And get this, he left the band while Tempted was out in America as a single. So he waited until the single that he was doing the lead vocals on was out in the charts. The band were touring America again. At the end of that tour, he had an offer to go and join Nick Lowe in a band that Nick had an idea to put together. I don't think anything became of that band. I think Paul ended up playing on maybe a couple of Nick Lowe's solo records, but that band, whatever it was, I can't remember the name of it. So anyway, he left Squeeze, left them in the lurch, and Glenn Tilbrook and Chris Difford were really not very happy about it at all, because it was the second keyboard player they'd lost in, about 18 months. And as I said, the single was in the charts, Paul was singing lead vocals on it, there was a video with him in the video, and he left the band whilst that was going on. So yeah, make sense of that. This one is quite a funny example. XTC and the drummer Terry Chambers. This is the last album he played on, Mumma, although he doesn't play on all of it because he walked out of the band essentially. He was not too happy with the way the group had started to head off into a more pastoral direction, leaving behind some of the crash bang wallopy kind of songs that they'd been doing up until this point. A few folky strands had come into their music on English Settlement. It was obvious that that Andy and Colin, the two main songwriters of the band, were going to continue down that avenue on this record. And Terry Chambers just left the band one day, just completely out of the blue. He just put his drumsticks down after a particular song that they've been rehearsing and just said, sorry guys, I'm just not into this music. And he just walked out of the rehearsal place. He took his cigarette packet with him apparently, but left his drumsticks behind and the drum kit behind as well. And within a few weeks or a couple of months, he'd emigrated to Australia or America or somewhere like that, and he left his drum kit behind. And I was going to say never looked back. That's not quite true. In more recent times, ironically, Terry Chambers is the only member of XTC to be trading on the name now. He's got his own band, XTC, that's EXTC, who are a great little band. I saw them play live last summer at the Shrewsbury Festival, and they were really good, and Terry was playing brilliantly. But yeah, he walked out on XTC, and that's just the way it happens. So there we go, that's that one. And finally, we'll do something slightly different. So this is where a musician doesn't so much walk out of the band. They do walk out of the band, but in doing so, they end the band, because essentially the band is a vehicle for them. And one of the big examples of that is Bill Nelson, who disbanded Bebop Deluxe after their fifth album, Drastic Plastic, in, I think it was 1981. Not entirely sure why. He'd already started to take the band down a more electronic pop direction, which is where he was going to take his solo career anyway. Maybe it was the repetition for him, or maybe the realisation that the band had peaked, particularly in America. It had some success, but it was starting to dip a little bit. Maybe he just felt that he didn't want to get pigeonholed as being this kind of 1970s, slightly glammy art rock kind of band. Just for whatever reason, he just disbanded the group and just went off and did a solo career. And he never really crossed over again. I mean, he has a lot of fans. Bill Nelson has a lot of very faithful fans, and they've followed him through thick and thin and bought all the solo releases. But I mean, he's just the archetypal cult artist, really. And in Bebop Deluxe, arguably, he had the chance, a bit like Queen had done, to survive the 1970s, move through into the 1980s, and to carry on developing that unit with that band, but it just wasn't for him, just wasn't interested, so he disbanded. And I think this was the first solo record he did, Bill Nelson's Red Noise. There he is on the back. So yeah, that's quite an interesting take on it, isn't it? I suppose you could say Paul Weller did something quite similar with the Jam, really. He left the Jam, i.e. he disbanded the Jam, and that was the end of it. Anyway, there are other examples. I've decided to limit myself as usual, but if you can think of any more, drop them in the comments. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon. Take care. Bye.